Keys to continuous testing using the public cloud. We are brought to you today by Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. My name is Mark Herbert. I am a Software Quality Assurance Analyst for Dignity Health, and I am also the Vivint Local User Group Leader here in Arizona, as well as a member of the Vivint Board of Directors, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator today. Looking forward to this webinar. With us, we have we're privileged to have Kelly Emo, Director of App Testing, Product and Technical Marketing for HPE, as well as Shane Evans, Director of Project Management, Functional Testing Solutions, which is actually the area I work in. So I'm especially interested to hear what Shane has to say today. So I actually was going to take a few moments and have both Kelly and Shane give a little background on themselves. Kelly, why don't we start with you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're signing on from. It's my pleasure to be able to present an area of extreme interest for me. Basically, I've been involved with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise application delivery management solutions for quite some time, about 10 years, different roles in product technical solutions marketing. And over the last few years, I've very much focused in the area of continuous testing and testing challenges that we all face from a quality perspective as we're trying to do things faster in a very rapidly changing world, and you'll be hearing more perspective on those challenges in today's session. So again, excited to be here, and it's a great opportunity to speak to all of you.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. Shane, what about you?
Thanks, Mark. And just one small correction, actually Director of Product Management for Functional Testing Solution, but probably my fault in sending the text there. I've actually been with HP for quite some time now, coming on my 8th year, in 5 of those years in product management, formerly responsible for the LoadRunner product, and now shifted over to functional test and test automation, which is actually where I started my career almost 20 years ago, as a customer of Mercury Interactive, and then Mercury and HP. So here we are.
So you go back to the WinRunner days like myself then?
That's right. I was actually a user of LoadRunner 6.5.
Oh, great. I go back to the test director days where you had to do a client install, with like an actual fat client install, not even through a browser. So, yeah, cool. All right, great. Just a few items of housekeeping, folks, before Shane and Kelly get started. This is a live session. It's being recorded and is intended for all Vivint members. The recording will be posted in the webinar section of the Vivint website and visible to all members after the session wraps up and the files all properly uploaded and such. Additionally, today's slide deck and webinar recording will be made available to you. We will send a link via email once everything is posted to the Vivint website. And as far as viewing the presentation today, to enlarge the presentation pane on your screen, if you just click the rectangle in the upper right corner of the presentation pane, that's the one in the picture that's being pointed at with the red arrow there. That will allow you to, make it a bigger view for you in the event that it's a little too condensed for you right now. Also, another nifty feature here in this platform that we're using to deliver our webinars, if you have questions as you go along, please type them and send them using the Q&A pane on the left-hand side of your screen. And you can type in your question and then click on the Ask button. To ask the question and to receive it in your native language, that's a new feature we have with this platform we're using now. If you click on the flag in the upper left corner of your screen, will launch a language selector box. Then you can click the radio button next to your country or language of choice, and then click apply. And then from that point forward, you'd be able to type in your own native language, and then it would come across in the appropriate language on the other side to generate the responses. So that's it as far as housekeeping. So let's get started. I'll pass it over to Shane and Kelly and let them give us some great information here. Take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. Again, this is Kelly, and again, really happy to be here to talk about this dynamic area of continuous testing and share with you some insights not only around the challenges that we've been seeing working with many of you across the globe on how to successfully test in today's very dynamic environment, but also share with you some insights, best practices, and suggestions for how you can approach continuous testing by utilizing the resources of the public cloud. And really, really interesting topic today is everything is changing faster and faster. So I'm going to kick it off. Shane and I are going to be very conversational about how we do this webinar. So you may hear us kind of going back and forth on some of the concepts that we're sharing today. Just kind of keep it kind of dynamic, keep it kind of fun. And I really want to encourage all of you to ask your questions, bring them forward. There is going to be some time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. We've done some dry runs and designed this so that there is a little extra time at the end, because I think this topic is the right one for lots of interesting discussion and questions. So with that, I want to dive right in. You're also going to find that we're using some rather fun metaphorical graphics that will help you kind of keep top of mind the different challenges that we're talking about. So I'm going to really kick it off with setting up the stage, really reviewing the landscape that we face as testers in today's world, and hopefully trigger some of these thoughts in your own minds about some of the challenges that you're currently grappling with, that you're currently dealing with, and get you thinking about, what are some approaches maybe that you're currently using, or some approaches that maybe you haven't considered to get ahead of this. So let's talk about the landscape. Let's talk about the world that we all interact in. Across the board, every industry is getting pushed with business pressures to deliver new innovation faster, whether it's to mitigate a competitor or a new disruptor that's coming in to your environment, or just to deal with customer demands, because customers today are expecting from the get-go an amazing user experience. And it's getting more and more complicated how they get that user experience. If you look on the left-hand side of this slide, you see just the huge trends that are going on in social media, the mass amounts of data that is being created by the natural interactions that people have day to day with their mobile devices, with all the different digital interfaces, and just how much content is getting created that can give them that experience. On the flip side, however, with all of this activity, all of this data, all of these different interfaces and devices, there are more and more ways that things can go wrong. And if a customer experiences a quality issue, whether it's in how they're perceiving the user experience, whether it's the performance and response time, whether it's that they were expecting a certain set of functionality and it didn't deliver what they were expecting, the amount of time it takes to go from that perception to broadcast and to an impact on your brand is getting shorter and shorter. So quality is becoming more and more critical in this world of disruptions, in this world of new technologies, of heightened customer expectations and proliferations of devices. So the key to success really is not just speed, but it's quality. And testing is really at the cornerstone of this. And I think this will resonate with all of you. It's where we are today. We're finding that while organizations are trying to go faster and faster, adopting methodologies like DevOps, continuous integration, and continuous delivery, it's absolutely critical that we get at the forefront of that as quality professionals. We drive in the importance, the cultural importance of quality, and we engineer in the ability to test earlier, to test more, and to make testing part of the continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline. But there are a lot of challenges when you're trying to speed up and you're trying to test faster. I've already mentioned you got to test earlier. You got to test as early in the cycle as possible. And you're probably going to be testing not only earlier, but much more frequently. If you're checking in code changes every day, you're doing a continuous integration every night, you want to be testing as part of that process. But this then puts pressure on things like execution time. You can't have a situation where it takes hours to execute your tests if you're doing continuous integration on a daily basis. And not only are you dealing with the execution time challenge, you're dealing with the multiple platforms challenge. It's not just a computer now with an operating system and maybe a couple of browsers. It's many browsers, maybe many OSs, different kinds of devices and form factors. So you've got tablets, you've got mobile phones, you even have things. So you're shrinking the amount of time you have to test, and you're increasing the number of platforms you're having to test on. The other issue that you're going to run into is that your applications themselves have become more complicated. So you're in a situation where an application is not just a three-tier application. You're talking about some of our past and some of the older testing products like WinRunner and having a client install. That was the old model, you know, the front end, the middle tier, the data tier. What we have today are services that are composed. And those services started out as a few coarse-grained, but they're becoming more and more fine-grained. You're dealing with more services out in the cloud, more microservices. So the number of endpoints, the number of integration points that you're testing are increasing as well. So all of these are putting pressure on the testing teams. And so how do you get ahead of that? There's a number of different practices that we can put in place and things we can leverage to get ahead of that and do continuous testing successfully. But before we get into those best practices, let's kind of do a step back also and think about the different kinds of testing that you may be interacting with, and put that in perspective of these challenges of execution time, number of devices, and shortened cycle times. So you're probably all familiar with the testing pyramid, but it's good to kind of think that through and think about how these different kinds of testing or types of testing would really be optimized in a continuous testing environment. So when you think about testing, it starts with the lowest level testing, which are unit tests. And these are really the tests that you want to execute closer to your development activities. They're much faster to perform, and in theory, they should be run in greater numbers. But I'm saying should because we've done a number of surveys, and in these surveys, we're finding that, unfortunately, a lot of developers are not doing unit testing. So we really want to encourage increased unit testing as part of your continuous testing process, because it's one of the ways that you're going to get faster feedback on the potential impact of code changes to your application landscape and ultimately track more predictable quality. Really, you should be running unit tests for every change that is checked into the code. When you move on to the higher level tests, you're talking about things like API tests. They're run a little bit less frequently, and they take a little more time and effort to build and maintain, but they're still very optimal for automation and really could be run with every build. At the top level, you have your GUI testing, your UI testing. These will typically fall more towards the end of the cycle. They're more challenging to perform. They tend to be a little more brittle. But you do have opportunities to automate them, in particular when you're doing a lot of reuse of the back end of composite applications as well. And those back-end APIs might be changing, but the UI might be staying the same. So we're going to explore different types of UI testing in particular, because those do tend to take the longest or most effort to automate. And we'll talk about some of the challenges when we look at automating GUI testing. Finally, we have exploratory testing, and that is still very much a valuable part of delivering a great user experience, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on exploratory testing today. We're going to really focus more on the tests that we automate through UI service and unit testing, and then how we can apply practices with the public cloud to make that even more efficient. So also, when you think about testing, you think about manual testing versus automated testing. First we have manual testing, still a lot of it out there. We've done a lot of research. As much as the industry is very focused on test automation, we're still finding many organizations do a lot of manual testing, rely on more than 50%. Even though some say it's a thing of the past, it's it's going to be around it's basically here to stay, is the way to put it. One thing we can all agree on, though, is manual testing is slow. And it can be painful, although a lot of new tools and recent tools are available to help speed up things like injecting data for manual testing or testing across in parallel a couple of devices. It still takes a lot of time to set up, takes a lot of time to execute and document. And then after you've run your manual tests, you have those efforts to reset everything after each iteration. So when you think about a testing strategy for continuous testing, I think most people would agree manual testing should be avoided wherever necessary, but there is going to be some that continues on when you move into different Agile applications. It really depends on your environment and your applications. But with that in mind, we're going to focus predominantly today on the automated testing. So for the remainder of this discussion, we're really going to focus on automated testing and how to optimize that for continuous testing and how to utilize the public cloud. We're going to focus on the challenges faced in implementing automated testing, the challenges in execution and maintenance of those tests and test environments, and how applying public cloud resources can really help solve for some of those, actually for a majority of them. So when you think about automated testing, it takes time and effort, although it really is much less effort in the long run than manual testing. One of the things we've seen working with our customers across the board over the last many years is that automating, getting a practice of test automation in place takes upfront effort in terms of skilling up, getting comfortable with the process of automated testing, understanding the application architecture, so determining what to automate, building those reusable automated assets. That's the effort up front. But in the long run, it's going to be much less effort than relying on manual testing, because what you're really going to get is you're going to get an effect where the more you can reuse your test automation, the more you're able to save that time. And here's a fun little kind of formula for thinking about that. So the amount of work saved through automation is divided by the amount you can reuse. And so the more iterations you gain from automation, the less work you ultimately have performed over time. So that really needs to be a primary goal. How can I create an environment that enables me to reuse as much of my test automation assets as possible? And if you apply that concept to the challenge of all these different devices, all these different operating systems, browsers, form factors, that's where you can really get some power for reusing those test automations in a very efficient way. So let's think about, or let's dive into, let's get started with automation. What are some of those challenges and how do we start to solve for them, when you're thinking about applying test automation in continuous testing? So for those of you that are not as familiar with the concept of continuous testing, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what that process looks like, and then diving into where those challenges are going to feel most acute and where we can really apply some of the practices around using the private cloud and really scaling out continuous testing. So when we think about continuous testing, it starts with this idea that you're doing continuous integration. So you're dealing with a practice that is common in DevOps, where every time you're making code changes, you're checking them into a continuous integration environment, making sure they build, and you're doing that at a regular iteration. Oftentimes we hear about doing it nightly. So we'll assume you have some sort of an application lifecycle management engine in place that's helping drive that orchestration, or you might be doing it right with your continuous integration product itself, like Jenkins or TeamCity. So this gives you the ability to orchestrate that process, orchestrate that code, check in that build, and then if you want to be doing testing, it can trigger those test executions. So for every test you want to run in parallel, you're going to be checking or triggering it with your CI engine, but it's also going to require an execution engine. And that test execution engine is usually running on a machine that's either physical or virtual. Let me kind of build this out. I know this is a little build here. So here you have your test execution engines, and in this graphic here we're showing a couple of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise solutions, UFT and our UFT Pro, which you may be familiar with under the name of LeanFT. We also see a lot of people using Selenium for their test execution as well. So you've got to deal with that. You've got to deal with the fact that you're going to be running these execution engines for every test that you're automating as part of your CI process. So that sounds okay, but as you start to multiply this out, you start to multiply that number by all of the different browser versions, and operating systems that you need to cover, and you start seeing a very large number of test executions that you need to perform. So this is a challenge that we need to solve for when we're doing continuous testing. Let's take that and apply it to mobile. So same scenario, you're doing continuous testing and you're orchestrating your continuous integration and testing process with your CI engine. And you're going to run your tests on your execution engines, your UFT or Selenium, and then you want to be able to run them in a mobile environment. So you may be using a mobile environment solution like Mobile Center. The challenge that you have, however, with running tests on mobile devices is the test execution engines usually have a one-to-one relationship with your mobile devices. So what ends up happening is you have an equal number of execution machines for every device you need to cover. And this can be quite time-consuming to set up, unless you're going to do them in a serial manner, and that's going to increase the overall execution time, and that's not really an ideal situation for mobile. So you've got this challenge where you're going to have this mushrooming number of execution engines and mobile devices that you're dealing with in a continuous integration and continuous testing scenario. So you see that continuous integration and continuous testing holds a lot of promise for applying automation rapidly when you're trying to do very quick delivery of software in a DevOps environment. But the big challenge that you're going to quickly run into, the thing you really need to solve for, is that mushrooming number of execution engines, execution time, and number of devices. And that can quickly take your testing off a cliff. So it's a little metaphor there. So how do we get ahead of that? Again, thinking about these main challenges, you can optimize your test execution across a matrix of browsers and devices by reducing the number of tests that you need to run. And so the key there is to test only what's changed. And you can do that across a targeted set of regression tests. But you still need to factor in, as you're planning for that, a couple of key factors like environment coverage. So you've got your regression test, you've got an optimal number of tests, but really focusing on what's the right number of environments that I need to cover with these tests that are really going to align with what our users are doing, and also the amount of time it's going to take and resource availability. So these are some of the things that you need to factor in as you're planning for your continuous testing process in an automated environment. And Shane, was there anything you wanted to pop in there? I heard a little voice in the background or a little noise or everything.
No, it's interesting. Something you mentioned earlier about, developers and unit testing, for example. If anyone was interested in some of the research that Kelly mentioned, you can find it in the current and historical world quality reports that we have created every year with Capgemini for the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. And that shows a trend. And it shows that not all of our developers are doing unit testing. Not all of our testing is being automated. I know a lot of this might sound obvious, that, hey, automation is better than manual, especially for those of us who are kind of in the choir and have heard this for many years. But it's still a message that I feel needs to get out there. So if you're finding challenges in your organization, there's great assets available for you to show your management teams that, hey, this is still an area that we need to invest in. What we're trying to show here is how does that translate over when you start to deliver on automation? What are some of the challenges that you might face after the fact? You've dealt with that maybe the hard challenges of how do I automate for this type of application or for this business process? Now the challenge becomes how do I execute this and scale it out to represent all of the needs of my end users, whether they're public-facing or internal.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great input there, and I would encourage you all to take a look at that research as well. So, just kind of two other challenges, and then I'm going to hand it over to Shane to actually share how do we solve for these challenges. I'm sure you're all probably thinking, okay, we've been talking about the challenges, how do we get to the solutions? I want to put one other perspective on this before we go into the second part of the presentation, and that's you may be thinking, or you may have already tried this solution where I'm doing continuous testing, I'm applying automation, I've got to think about my coverage, my execution time, and my resource availability. Let me see how I optimize my test environments to do that. And you may be building a test lab capability for your testing teams, but what we're seeing a lot of times is the volume is where you're going to see the primary challenges. So just a couple of cute little graphics here. Let's say you're setting up a testing environment for web applications and you're trying to optimize across your different browsers. Where you're going to be struggling or challenged to maintain this from a test environment perspective is providing both the infrastructure and the people that can keep up with the latest versions of the browsers, the security fixes, the patches, and also ensure that those back-end resources and execution engines are available when the different testing teams across your Agile teams need to use them. So it may at first seem manageable, but very quickly we've seen it get very challenging when there's more volume, more demand to access those test environments and to keep up, and I see this day in and day out, with all the browser updates that are out there, and those security fixes in particular seem to catch me off guard quite a bit. So, if there's a way to enable that to be more of a service rather than you having to maintain that, it's something to definitely consider, and that's what we're going to talk about in the second part of this presentation. Over on the mobile side, and I'll quickly build this out as well, because we've hit on a number of these topics already, but I think the same problem exists, but even more so, because you're dealing with maintaining devices and device access, and the pace, the rate of change in terms of the mobile devices, the mobile operating environments, just the different variants really gets out of control. And there exists some forms of emulators and simulators, but they're really not to the maturity level yet of things like desktop virtualization. So we're seeing it being a lot more difficult to maintain that level of availability for your different Agile teams when you're testing against mobile devices and you're trying to manage it all in-house. So with that really sets the stage for how do we solve for these challenges? Where are we seeing some approaches that have really proven strong solutions for maintaining your environment, your execution, your availability? So I'm going to turn it over to Shane now to dive into how to get ahead of this curve. So with that, I will let go of the mouse and let Shane take it from here.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. One thing I want to mention on the mobile device side is there's a great video on Facebook, actually, from the Facebook for Development team. And they describe the problem exactly as you just showed it with regards to mobile testing, where they decided that they needed to do mobile testing with real devices because they found even, for example, two devices of the same brand, the same version, the same operating system, the same everything would behave slightly differently. And they needed to test across these to optimize really the functionality and performance in all scenarios, not just the clean room, virtualized emulator or simulator environment, which you might think is more predominant in such a large mobile-centric company like Facebook. But they've actually built out a considerable mobile device testing lab to suit these needs because they found it was really night and day difference between testing on emulators. So next, we'll talk about some of the ways that we can accelerate your continuous testing by maybe leveraging scalable cloud services in place of physical device labs, virtualized browser labs, and mobile device labs, which can be very expensive, can cost a lot in terms of people power to maintain them, and don't guarantee service availability for when you really need it. So first, we need to understand that not all cloud services are created equally. Some provide you with the elastic infrastructure you need, but as we saw from earlier, that's only part of the problem. Other solutions provide a platform for application development and testing, but often these are codependent solutions, meaning the environment used for development and testing are usually the same. So this doesn't solve the problem of environment coverage and parallel execution that we saw earlier as well. Lastly, where we'll spend most of our time is the software as a service solutions that are available. And this provides sort of the balance between environment and infrastructure availability, performance, the environment coverage, and parallel execution that we talked about, and really offers the most value for the needs of testing. So even within software as a service solution, it's important to understand there's different types of software solutions available. So public cloud can be the inexpensive first choice, but is usually accompanied by several limitations such as device privacy and guaranteed availability. Then you have virtual private and managed private cloud solutions, which can be more expensive than public, but offer increased control over your environment. In a virtual private cloud, for example, the infrastructure is still hosted in a public environment, but is allocated specifically to your needs, while a managed private cloud environment is entirely dedicated to you. Lastly, we have the on-premise cloud. This consists of a dedicated infrastructure and dedicated people, and can be the most expensive solution available. So we're going to be spending most of our time here in the middle with the virtual private and managed private cloud, as we see that really offers, again, the most balance between the two worlds. The decision for you should boil down to the return on investment. You want to choose a cloud solution that provides you with the right amount of environments and devices to suit your needs, while freeing up resources and saving time and maintaining security so you can focus on delivering value to your business. You really don't want to be spending time managing a test environment for your testing needs. And this is something I actually hold near and dear. It's something that I did once in my career for a short time, managing a test lab. And I can tell you that it's not simple as it may sound. So next we'll look at some of the more tangible considerations that you'll need to make when selecting a service to meet your needs, the types of requirements that will impact your day-to-day when testing using a cloud-based solution. First, the solution needs to be compatible with your chosen tools. Otherwise, you may end up throwing away a lot of investment in the creation and maintenance of your test framework. There are many services on the market today that support only a single automation solution, usually Selenium. This may be all you're looking for, but again, it's something to consider. Second, make sure the service provides the capacity, performance, connectivity, and security that's required to support your application delivery. Several players focus on publicly available services, which I mentioned before can be inexpensive but prone to security risks. Your applications may also be internally developed, which can require special connectivity solutions such as VPN or on-premise bridge. If you're unsure what this means, be sure to ask, of course, whatever provider that you're working with as you shop around for a solution. Data privacy and security should also be a concern. While it is the best practice not to expose your sensitive data in a test environment, you wouldn't want your application or test data to be leaked in any way. A wrong turn in this area specifically can be a real challenge. And lastly, it's important that the cloud testing service is capable of integrating with your DevOps toolchain. In many cases, RESTful APIs may be available, and a few providers offer out-of-the-box configurations. Otherwise, it may be difficult to leverage such a service in the context of your CI/CD pipeline. I point out a few here, such as ALM Octane, Jira, TFS, but there's, of course, many more tools to consider here. This is just a sample. And lastly, I want to take a minute and focus on value. So it's fairly common for a test execution service to be compatible with leading open source tools, and things like scale, security, and reliability have become less of an issue in recent history. So we want to focus on some of the features that you should look for in a solution over and above all of this. First, a test execution service should do more than simply run your tests on command. It should allow you to optimize your test execution and ultimately drive costs down and the effort associated with test automation for your business. This can be done in several ways, such as root cause analysis, environment and test optimization, and automated test generation. What do each of these mean? Well, first, by analyzing your test runs, the service should be able to tell you how to resolve common failures. For example, if every time your test touches a specific UI control or a version of Chrome, the test execution service should alert you to this issue. This requires insight to the test itself, rather than just provisioning machines and sending some commands to execute the test. So we really need to be tightly coupled with the test execution engines, the tools that are being used, the analytics coming from production, from your ALM tools, and really have a sort of holistic view of your test execution, rather than just treating the service as sort of a dumb robot that executes the commands for you. Second, using information gathered from production monitoring systems like Google Analytics, New Relic, Web Trends, and others, the service should be able to tell you which environments need to be tested. This should save you from having to analyze the data yourself and apply that learning to your tests in some sort of automated way. For example, if 90% of your users are coming in on Chrome on Mac OS, or more importantly, if your iOS users are all experiencing issues, these should be areas that you cover in your test execution. What better way to do that than to integrate, again, with those services from production or from your ALM tools. And lastly, through a deeper understanding of the production usage data, a more advanced solution should be able to actually generate more representative test scripts from your automation. For those of you who are familiar with HP Performance Center, for example, it should be possible to take production data and convert that into an executable set of tests. Even just a template in this case can mean the difference between knowing what your users are doing and guessing, which can save wasted cycles and drive out defects much sooner.
So, hey, Shane, you brought up three things I think that are really important to emphasize here, which is when you're thinking about really looking at a service, a cloud-based service for handling continuous testing, in essence, what you're talking about is it's not just about the underlying environment management, provisioning of resources, ensuring that you have available devices and environments that support your browser configuration matrix, but really that it's intelligently integrated with the testing, the automated test execution, and the analytics as well. Is that a good way to start to summarize some of the things you're talking about?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole bunch of providers out there that will give you a lab. They'll give you browsers, they'll even give you mobile devices. And that is a large part of the problem, as we focused quite a bit on today, but it's not the whole problem. Really, once I have the environment available, what do I do with it? And how do I use it in the most optimal way so that I'm testing only what I need to, when I need to, and that I'm maybe not over-testing or under-testing. And a service that's connected in the right way should be able to do that.
Very cool. I may have stole your conclusion.
So, yeah, not really. So, I mean, in the end, what it boils down to is first selecting the type of solution that meets your needs. We talked about, public cloud versus private cloud, virtual and managed, as well as on-premise. We talked about the different types of solutions, either pure infrastructure provisioning through to software as a service. And we talked about some of the challenges that you'll want to make sure, or some of the requirements that you want to make sure that are met at a minimum, such as tool interoperability, integrations with your DevOps tool chain. We talked about security, scalability, performance, all of these things that should really just be table stakes when it comes to selecting a service. You balance that against your sort of cost and your sort of satisfaction within those requirements versus, what would it take to build this out ourselves? And that's a question that a lot of organizations don't often ask themselves when they go and build a lab and they throw people and time and money at these things. Is what is the relative cost of managing the service ourselves versus working with a service provider? And lastly, looking for value add. Having ways to accelerate your testing should be in the front of your mind whenever selecting a service of this type. So it's not, as you said, just about test execution and having an environment that's available. That's a part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem. And if we're thinking about ways to optimize our test execution to drive down costs, to increase quality, a service like this should provide that as well. So we're just about done. I think we covered a lot of different points about this particular topic, but I wanted to just turn it over for a quick poll before we close it off. Mark, is that you?
Oh, there was a little delay on muting my line. Sorry about that. Yes, we do have a polling question. Shane and Kelly, thank you both very much. As you can see, folks, the question just popped up here for you. How are you currently provisioning your development and test lab resources? And you have a few different choices there: on-premise, private cloud, managed or virtual private cloud service, or full software as a service. Go ahead and take a couple seconds to reply to the choice that makes sense for you, and we'll see what that looks like.
And then once we're done here, I think there's some good questions that came in. We'll
have a little Q&A after this poll question. Okay. It looks like mostly everybody replied, and in looking at the results, on-premise was the leader with 13 responses. The next runner-up to that was managed or virtual private cloud service with 8 responses, followed by full software as a service with 2 responses. Private cloud is 0. So those were the on-premise is the leader there.
Great.
Interesting. Okay. Good split between on and managed service. So that's good.
No, I suspected most people are still working on-premise, but it's good to see that some people are leveraging some of the solutions that are available. Did we want to take a few minutes to answer some of the questions?
Absolutely. Definitely. That's so, folks, as you've been listening to the presentation, some of you have popped some questions here into the Q&A frame, so we'll go through some of those. Let's go ahead and take a look. First question here, you mentioned that in order to get efficiency from test automation, you need some ALM orchestration or a continuous integration solution. What level of tests do you recommend orchestrating in the life cycle, and how?
Good question, Shane. You want me to start that one and then hand it over to you for a little bit more color?
Sure.
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is we're really talking about when you're moving to an Agile or DevOps type of environment. And so what you're doing is you're checking in your code, you're building it, and you're running a CI process to ensure that those code changes can effectively integrate into the application release, the pipeline, basically. So you're going to really want to test not just that the code is functioning as expected, but you're going to want to test that what you've introduced doesn't break anything you already have. And if you can, you want to get some indication of, is there an impact on the performance behavior of that application as well. So you're most likely going to run a functional test and a regression test, an automated regression test, as part of that continuous integration process. That's where the automation comes in, and some of the best practices we talked about earlier in terms of really optimizing, knowing what environments you want to cover and what aspect of that where that change is having an impact in your regression test. But if you can also run a load test against it as well, that's another a good advantage of really ensuring continuous quality. And so, like at HPE, we have the ability, for instance, to integrate our unified functional testing solution, as well as our performance testing solutions under StormRunner Load, with a continuous integration engine like Jenkins or CloudBees or TeamCity. So that's one of the ways you can do that. You can actually use that CI engine as an execution engine and trigger those automated tests to run against each CI action that occurs in your process. So, Shane, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think in the context of the pyramid we talked about earlier, the types of tests really that should be executed with each and every build should be those lower level tests. Your unit tests, of course, every time change is made to the code, and your service or integrated tests for every sort of build cycle. The UI tests, which, as you mentioned, Kelly, tend to be more brittle. We want to have a certain set of tests that sort of satisfy your base level functionality that is automated as much as possible, that we can run each and every iteration. And those should be executed in an automated way as well. We have many examples of customers who are running a full suite of regression tests each and every day. We do it ourselves internally using our tools as well as some common tools on the market. And that's pretty much the best practice.
Cool. Very good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Another question here. How would an existing HPE test team leverage the best practices in automation that you've talked about today?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, while we're answering this and some of the other questions, and Scott, thank you for asking. Or no, it wasn't Scott. Sorry, it was Iqbal. There's a URL on the screen here that we're happy to announce, as you probably guessed from some of the topics in the webinar, that we've been working on such a solution for almost 2 years now. And we're now in private beta. We're soon to be launching public beta. And we're very excited to be, announcing this to you here today. This is probably the first public announcement that we're making, although we have shown several customers at road shows and whatnot. I'm here at the Selenium conference this week, and you might be wondering, what is HPE doing at a Selenium conference? We're actually sponsoring our third Selenium conference today here in Austin. And we're working with Selenium, and we're working with HP tools side by side. So for those of you who are using UFT, or you have UFT Pro or LeanFT, as it is previously known, which is also supporting Selenium. And all of these solutions together will be available to use with the cloud-based test execution service, which you can see by following the link here. So check it out. I won't get into a lot of detail there because we really wanted to focus on kind of the best practices here and what we see in the market, rather than trying to promote a solution. But please feel free and check it out. We'd love to have you sign on as a public beta user.
Cool. That's exciting news. And it's real cool to see you guys, at a Selenium conference and working in partnership and getting all these tools to work well together. That's fantastic. Another question came in here. Is there any ETA with UFT supporting Linux? More important, Docker UFT image would be swell.
ETA on supporting Linux. So we do support Linux and Mac now in LeanFT or UFT Pro. So we're bringing a lot of the capabilities and experience that we've built up many years of market leadership with UFT, and we're applying it to LeanFT. And you might ask, why not UFT? Why can't I have UFT on Linux? Well, there's a lot of technical reasons that are probably too much to get into here. Number one, it's built in a .NET IDE, and it supports Visual Basic as its primary language. Both of those are not well suited towards non-Windows platforms, although I understand there are .NET is open source and available. It's not really stable on these platforms and probably won't be. But LeanFT, which is built from the ground up to support multiple languages, so you can use Java, JavaScript, .NET, you can use different IDEs, you can use IntelliJ, you can use Eclipse, Visual Studio, and we're adding to these all the time. In the latest release, version 14 now supports Linux and Mac as well. And as I just mentioned, all of this LeanFT support can now accompany Selenium tests. So if your developers are using Selenium, or if you're using Selenium for web and mobile testing, we can now help with the creation and maintenance of those tests using LeanFT on Linux, on Mac, and on Windows. Now, the Docker image, by the way, just to answer the second part of that question, for the Docker image, UFT Docker image might not be the most interesting use case because it is a desktop client and you can simply install it on the desktop. But we are working with Docker, particularly on the LeanFT side, to package the execution engine as well as the tests that are required to test the application that's deployed via Docker in a single container. So that's something we're working on and expect to see that soon.
Great, great. We have time for a few more here, folks. So if you have any more questions, definitely keep putting them in. Another one here. Where did it go here? I just had it. It was about SaaS. Let me find it again. Oh, here we go. What are some of the key things I should ask a software as a service provider to ensure data privacy and security? I know where I work at Dignity Health, personal health information or private health information is, something we have to be very sensitive about. And so if we do anything in SaaS, we have to definitely make sure it's secure. And so what are some of your guys' thoughts there?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start that and then hand it over to Shane as well. But when you're talking about SaaS and really protecting your data, there's a number of different things that you want to ask and really get a trusted partner for your SaaS delivery. There's key certifications like the ISO, IEC certifications. You want to understand what is their information security policy. Do they have a strategy for business continuity? How do they handle access control? How do they handle asset management? A number of different things that a SaaS provider that can really give you an SLA to meet your security needs are critical. And if you check out like our strategy HPE software as a service across our ADM solutions, those are the types of SLAs that we deliver with our SaaS solution. So those are just a few of the things. Shane, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
Well, there is some standards that are available for organizations to adhere to ensure that they're keeping your personally identifiable information private, as well as your sort of test data and the data that you use on that system. I don't know the number offhand. If you were to do a quick search on ISO standard for personally identifiable information or PII, I'm sure it would come up. And I know that HP SaaS is certified in this area. I'm sure others are as well, but that's certainly one question that you can ask up front.
Great.
Cool. Sticking with the topic of SaaS, another one here, how would you recommend getting started with a SaaS-based testing environment? Conduct a pilot project? What if it's an agile team? How do we solve for multiple users?
I would start with going to this link. Join our private beta. I'll kick this one off too and then hand it over to Shane. But certainly I think starting at a project level is a really good way to get started. I think this goes hand in hand with moving to and adopting continuous testing practices and DevOps practices. And I think we have a webinar actually that we ran about a month ago that covered, how do you get started with DevOps as well. And our own HPE IT and our R&D teams really started that way. They picked some key projects that were getting a lot of pressure for faster delivery and had some real challenges in connecting the testing teams with the dev teams and meeting those cadences, starting to implement that CI process and engineer for that at a project level, and then using that as a best practice to then go out and encourage and teach the other teams how to get that started. So I think starting at a project level makes a ton of sense. Shane, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think the approach of the sort of pilot project always makes sense. Integrating your existing set of regression tests that are sort of the less fragile to make sure that you're not dealing with that as sort of a challenge in adoption. At least get what works consistently out of the way, so that you can you're always going to have challenges with automating new features, with changes to your applications. But as long as you're able to scale up, test what you need when you need it in an automated way using a service like this, then if that works, then the rest of it will fall into place.
Great. A couple more here because we have like 4 more minutes. So we'll do one more, and then we'll wrap it up. What are some of the key ROI data points we should focus on to decide between virtual private, managed private cloud, or on-premise lab?
That is a great question. I'm actually going to take advantage of the little thumbnails over here and grab. There was one slide in particular. I know we were addressing some of these aspects. Let's see, where did I? Anyway, so really, what you're looking at, and Shane, you can definitely pop in with this as well. I love that graphic. You really got to look at what is the makeup of your applications. How many devices are you going to need to test across? If this is a mobile-first application and you're trying and you really want to cover the gamut of mobile environments and also the frequency of change for your application, that's going to very much trigger, how many devices do you need to maintain? How many people are going to be required to maintain those devices? Do you have the ability to test in serial, or are you going to have to test in parallel because you have compression on your execution time? And so all of those things are going to factor in. And if you look at the cost on-prem for the people and the device maintenance versus the cost in a virtual or managed environment, then you also need to look at how compressed are your delivery cycles, where do you have to have guaranteed availability of those devices on demand, and then that will help define some of the deltas between virtual and managed. So it's really a function of how much testing are you having to do across how comprehensive of a set of devices and how compressed are your cycles. Shane, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that just about covers it.
Okay, great.
Awesome. One more late question just popped in. We'll take care of that, and then we'll start wrapping things up. What about migration projects? Who could those projects enabled? I'm not sure I'm following, but maybe you guys get. What about migration projects? That's what it literally says. What about migration projects? Who could those projects enabled? Maybe that was how could those projects be enabled?
Are you thinking about like migrating from on-prem out to cloud, or actually migrating an application? Could you use this kind of testing scenario for that? I guess we could probably take both approaches.
I think for the latter, at least, the migration of service or technology, either from one platform to another, or one, from traditional to web or what have you. And these are certainly complicated projects. Functionality is always, the first kind of requirement in these projects, and that you make sure everything works the way it worked before. So Thomas has expanded there, is migrating from a mainframe to a new tech front end, and that's exactly what I was thinking. You're coming from one technology to another. There's not a lot of reuse in terms of your automation between the old and the new, and generally not, anyways. And if you can, that would be an amazing feat. But certainly, testing for functionality is critical. As much as can be tested, in the new environment using automation, because you're bound to go through several iterations and releases before you get everything right to where it was in the previous technology, then yes, absolutely wanting to scale that up, particularly if you're supporting a wide number of devices, operating systems, and so on. If you're coming from an environment where everything's pretty static, you've got standardized browser, standardized operating system build, you've got no mobile client or maybe one that works for everyone, it might be less important. But I wanted to keep in mind that even if your primary objective is not a breadth of environment coverage, maintaining an environment for testing is a cost. And it's usually not one that's covered in the project plan or in the project budget. So, the provisioning or purchasing of hardware, having resources to maintain it, to build it, to refresh it whenever needed, all of these things can add up. So if you can connect to a service that will allow you to scale up your testing quickly without having to the ramp up and the investment required to do it yourself, I think it would be of value.
Awesome. Well, I mean, this has been awesome. I'm glad I was going to attend anyway. I'm glad Terry had me moderate as well. It's been great hearing what you guys presented. It's very interesting, and I'm hopeful to get the company I work for more going towards this direction with this information that'll help demonstrate some of that. So thank you very much, Kelly and Shane. Folks, just a reminder, as said earlier in the meeting, that all this content, the recording, the slides, and so forth, that'll be coming out over the next couple of days. There is a little survey at the end. If you wouldn't mind completing the short survey and opt in to hear more information from HPE, that would be great. So thank you. Be sure to check out this webinar later and other webinars we have going on in the future. So thanks again to Kelly and to Shane from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And on behalf of Kelly and Shane and myself, Mark, and the rest of the Vivint team, we want to thank you for attending today and look forward to seeing you next time. Everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.